Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan Zunger. I'm Chief Ethics Officer and a Distinguished Engineer at Humu. For the past 16 years, I've been here and at companies like Google, solving some of the world's biggest technical, privacy, and people problems. In August 2019, I gave a talk at the PEPR conference about risk, the ways it affects people's lives, the ways people experience it, and how we should think and talk about it. Here's what I said. You can find links to all the references I use in my talk below, and if you have any questions, please ask.
So hello everybody, and I'm going to be talking about some of the slightly weirder corner cases of our mutual work, parts that we don't talk about quite as often. And before I kick off, no work exists in a vacuum, nothing ever happens on its own, and a lot of this is actually the product of collaboration with Leah, whom you all know, and with Avi Flox, who works in the space of psychological safety and trauma and things like that, as well as with several other people in this room. So I'm really here as a representative of a lot of years of many people's joint work. I'd like to give the outline of a talk I'm not giving right now, just to sort of set this in context. Shaw actually gave a very nice version of this talk yesterday. I'm assuming that if you're in this room, you understand what trust is, why we might want to build for it, and so on. I'm going to be focusing very much on the how. And within that how, there's a process that we've been talking about, involving threat modeling and so on and so forth. And I'd like to focus specifically on the stage of triage and how we actually decide what to fix and how to go about fixing it. It's a part we don't often spend a lot of time on. So triage really includes three different things. There's identifying the possible responses to the threats that we've identified in earlier stages. There's prioritizing this threat mitigation, not just prioritizing it relative to other threats, but prioritizing it relative to all the other tasks that have to be done for a project. Right? I'm assuming now that you're seeing this now in the context not of I'm a privacy person, but there is a product that is trying to launch. And the third one that we really don't talk about very often is achieving consensus about this prioritization. And that's important because as a privacy engineer, you very rarely command the core engineering and product resources of the entire product team. Right? You are going to have to get a lot of people aligned to make sure that issues get fixed, that launches happen as they should, and so on. Doing this third step requires a lot of tools, a common language, a way to build an alignment of understanding among people. And often, tools that are useful for this third step are very helpful for doing that prioritization, and vice versa. And so what I'd like to do today is actually talk about a couple of tools that I've found over the years to be useful for this, with no attempt whatsoever at systematization. These are just, here's a couple of useful things I have in my toolbox, and they may be handy for you in some bizarre set of circumstances. Just a first overview question, why is triage hard in the first place? Well, there are two kinds of things that people are really terrible at estimating. Rare catastrophic events and continuous invisible impacts that add up. Funnily enough, the entire field of privacy is pretty much nothing but rare catastrophic events and continuous impacts that add up. Second, people are drowning in priorities. I mean, if you've ever been in the vicinity of a product launch, you will see there are so many important things that are happening at once. How do you sift through this? And the third is that different people have different threat models. This goes to what Giles was just talking about. Like, why is it important to have a diverse team? Because you're probably very bad at estimating the impact of various things on the daily life of someone whose life is very different from you. And if you happen to be a senior executive in a Silicon Valley tech company, that is going to be even more extreme, and their connection to reality may be even more tenuous. So given these things, there are a couple of tools now that I'd like to actually talk about. So the first one is what I call the universal value curve. And this is a tool for trading off product value against these rare catastrophic risks. And this is the basic shape of the curve. Given an amount of stuff, how much value comes out of it? Now, there's no specific equation for this curve, and I realize this looks ludicrously sketchy. My goal is to show you why it's actually useful, even though it is. It has two important features. As you go to the far right, this curve more or less levels off. It might keep crawling up a little bit, it might actually go level, it might turn downwards after some point, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't keep increasing unboundedly to the right. On the other hand, to the left, it goes very, very far down. I don't know exactly how far down it goes. I recommend you never hang around long enough to find out how far down things can go. But that's a basic shape. So let's try to apply this concept to a single user of a single product. And so in this case, our x-axis is the amount of work you're putting into features of the product, quality of the product, and so on. And we're looking at the value the user gets. Obviously, there's a 0 point where your product doesn't exist. And at some point, presumably, your product makes people's lives better. If not, maybe you shouldn't be building this product in the first place. However, even the best, photo sharing app or app to put like funny faces on things and so on has only a finite value to any given person. There are a couple of kinds of products where this curve gets weird, like if you're talking about life-saving goods, but even then it turns out that the principles apply, but your curve may be shaped differently. Think about that for yourself. On the far left, however, things can go arbitrarily badly wrong. Now, you may have seen this curve before in another context. This is the curve of happiness as a function of money. And I actually want to spend a little bit of time on this application of it because it actually helps you understand where this curve comes from, why it exists and has this shape it does. Take a person who's sort of living on this point of the curve. This is your average like middle to upper middle class existence. Barring major disaster, I'll be okay. Now, if you give this person additional money, even a great deal of additional money, their main response is, hey, check out this cool watch. Right? There are pleasant events that happen, but their basic sense of stability in life doesn't actually change much. And there's a lot of psychological research about this notion of homeostasis, equilibrium. People tend to return to the same net level of happiness fairly quickly. When you start to go to the left, you start to worry, hey, what happens to my family if I get sick? If my babysitter flakes, I'll lose my job. I'm not sure what I'm going to eat tonight. Right? This curve can go pretty far down. And I think this is actually the key to understanding what's going on here. Simpler phrasing, money can't buy you happiness, but poverty can buy you one hell of a lot of misery. So what's actually happening in this curve? On the left-hand side of the curve, what's really happening is that money is buying you safety by mitigating risks. And the reason this curve is so steep is because very small differential amounts of money can make a very big difference. There are a lot of problems in this world you can get out of if you have 20 bucks in your pocket. There's a lot of problems that you can get out of if you have 100 bucks that 20 bucks wouldn't get you out of. And 500 bucks will get you out of a lot of problems that 100 bucks won't get you out of. However, there are very few problems in this world that $10,000 will get you out of that 9,500 wouldn't have gotten you out of too. And it's because of that increasing sparsity of impacts of money that this very steep risk mitigation effect starts to level out as you move to the right. On the other hand, once you start to get into the right, then the curve starts to be dominated instead by emotional homeostasis. The tendency of people to return back to roughly the same hedonic state they were in to begin with after things have ended. Economists might call this the diminishing marginal value. But this is where that shape tends to come from. I see some people actually reading the references I've attached here. The core idea is this. Most human happiness does not come from discrete hedonic events or even continuous positive circumstances. It comes from eliminating stressors. Basically, happy things are great, but unhappy things grind on you day after day after day. Anyone who has ever lived on the left-hand side of this financial curve, I think you'll remember what this can be like. So let's take this curve now and try to apply it not to a single person, but to a total population. Right? This is something that matters a lot when you're designing products. Here now, I have how happy each individual user is, so their own y-axis. But here the y-axis is how much do I, as a privacy person or as a product designer or someone like that, actually give a damn. And this one also has the same shape. Why? Well, okay, consider I just heard from a user whose job I saved by means of this product versus I just watched someone get harassed on my product. I think we've all been in situations similar to these. There's a big difference. There's a dynamic range in the feelings we get when a product succeeds or fails. On the other hand, I just made someone infinitely happy. Like, what does that even mean? Right? Even if there were a utility monster out there who literally became infinitely happy, the number of fucks given is actually bounded above. On the other hand, I just read the coroner's report. I actually softened what was originally on this slide. As you all know, very, very bad things can happen when we do our jobs wrong. Right? Safety accidents can have horrifying impacts, and those will stick with you for a very long time. Not just as privacy engineers, they will stick with the entire product team. Things can hurt a lot. So that last application might seem obvious, but how many of your product success metrics increase unboundedly per user? If you have a metric like total engagement seconds, that can create a very perverse incentive, right? Because what you've really done is you've allowed a single user to weight you way out beyond what you actually care. Did the user actually get happier? Do you actually care more about what's happening on the right? And if total engagement seconds is directly tied to, say, a financial metric, if you're getting paid per second or per ad shown or something like that, you're in a situation where there's a real risk that the incentives that your company is being pushed towards don't align with user goals. And in this case, it's actually very important to talk about short-term versus long-term user happiness. It turns out there are various things you can do to get someone to engage a lot in the short term, which in the long term are actually very negative for the user. And in the long term, this can actually cause structural foundational problems for your company. Not that any of us have ever encountered companies that might try to do such a thing. So to summarize this part, this curve is useful for assessing risks, designing metrics, and conveying trade-offs. When you're on the right-hand side of this curve, be quantitative. Look at unbounded metrics very carefully. Compare, are you alienating users? Are you acquiring users? What's happening in the short and long term? Talk about, when you're talking to leadership teams and so on, talk about PR risk, legal risk, regulatory risk, or depending on who you're talking to, you can actually talk about human harm. When you're on the left-hand side of the curve, though, I actually want to urge you not to be quantitative. The reason is that the product of a very large number and a very small number, so steep curve and a small probability, is not a medium number, it is statistical noise. You cannot estimate this number accurately enough for it to actually be useful. Instead, treat this as a count and use narrative. So count how many negative events happen and treat the graph as an illustrative tool. Use it to communicate this idea. How many deaths per year is this feature worth? That's always a really nice, disturbing question to have to ask someone in the executive review meeting. Consider asking those questions mostly in attorney-client privilege meetings. So that's it for the universal value curve. Let me switch over now to a second tool called the Gottman ratio. If you've ever heard of John Gottman, he's actually not from privacy. He is one of the leading lights in the field of marriage and family therapy. And this is a very important experimental result from Gottman's work, that relationships need to have a 5-to-1 ratio of positivity to negativity during conflict. It turns out this is actually a much more broadly applicable tool, and I found it extremely useful, specifically in the space of UX design. Essentially, what you're looking at is positive moments experienced by the user versus negative moments experienced by them. And positive ones, don't even think just privacy, think UX design. It's like the aha or a task accomplishment or pleasure versus moments when they feel stuck or the program is broken or they're feeling something really actively dangerous like harassment. You actually want to keep the ratio of positive to negative events at, it's ballpark 5-to-1 was specific to marriage, but this rough sort of number seems to actually be key. Now, why am I bringing this up? Let's zoom in a bit on what's happening physically to a human during this process. Your body is a very sophisticated instrument for detecting danger cues. This is the process of neuroception. These negative moments that we're seeing, what they actually are is what your body is registering as an unsafety signal. Something is wrong. And did I just lose my file, or am I being attacked, or anything like that? These are all in the same category, and you're going to feel these spikes of adrenaline and cortisol and various comprehensible neurochemical changes going on in your body when this happens. This is the same kind of unsafety that we were just talking about as being the event that drives the left-hand side of that value curve. And some useful numbers to remember, these unsafety responses, because your body is rigged to catch them pretty quickly, they tend to happen along the autonomous nervous system, and they're happening on the time scale of tens or hundreds of milliseconds. However, the decay of this activation spike, of this emotional activation spike, is much slower because it's happening through metacognitive processes as you think through, oh wait, hold on, everything's okay, I'm safe, you're talking to yourself. And so the decay of this curve happens on the scale of seconds to hours. Now, here's an interesting thing though, the triggering threshold, like how big an event does it need to trigger that spike, is a function of your current emotional reserves. As your emotional reserves get drained, it triggers more easily. Basically, people stop looking for safety signals around them and start looking for confirmation signals that they actually are in danger. This, of course, this is a huge field of research that branches off of just this statement right here. And as you notice, of course, if the sensitivity increases as a function of existing activation, you have a classic positive feedback loop. And so what can very quickly happen is if something gets triggered, you get an initial spike, and if there are re-triggers then, they can happen more and more easily until the person basically is pegged at some extreme state of activation. And the initial susceptibility of a person to that trigger has to do with a person's baseline level of emotional safety, which has a lot to do with their daily life, these differences in life, and what things they might be particularly sensitive to depend a lot on the details of their lives. This goes to why diversity is so important in teams. An important thing to remember is this: a single source can trigger the same signal over and over and over again. So let's say you receive a harassing message or something. You read it, you get this alarm. Like a few seconds later, you go like, "Did I really read that?" You read it again. Oh, guess what? You just re-triggered the thing. Until you can actually stop that thing, it can potentially keep going. There are all sorts of things that can do that. If you trigger like, "Wait, is this okay?" and then people around you are freaking out, that can re-trigger it. If you're in a dangerous environment, there's a long-standing problem with hospitals for people who've just experienced trauma. That can trigger it. If you attempt to remedy this situation and your attempt fails, that can trigger it. And here's a slide basically full of numbers you can point VPs at. When people feel unsafe, they're less likely to explore, learn, exchange, use products. People actually stop using products, and in very non-trivial numbers when they experience this. And you'll notice, by the way, people who tend to leave the product, that tends to especially skew towards people who are female and people who are younger, and therefore people who are unlike senior executives at Silicon Valley software companies. So point them in numbers. Sometimes they ultimately understand this sort of thing. Use this ratio to design an interface and to highlight this kind of risk of user loss. Because honestly, some people are just like, if you try to explain to them what activation is, they are very emotionally switched off. They won't get it, but they will understand like user attrition rates. Whenever you can measure this ratio of positive to negative events directly, that happens to be a great user happiness metric, a great way to actually directly try to probe this curve, but that's often tricky to achieve. But important thing, when something goes wrong for a user, when a user encounters a negative event, minimize the time until the user can act to relieve the problem. We often think about buttons like a report of use button as being an ingress into this whole flow where we're analyzing the thing and sending it to human raters and so on and so forth. That's what that button looks like from our perspective, but from a user's perspective, that's an emergency stop switch. What they're trying to do is they want to just hit a button and make the frightening thing go away right now, right here. No flow required, no long-term operation. They need to get that sense of safety. They need to restore to safety fast, because if you can do that, you can short-circuit the positive feedback loop and actually drive people back to a sense of safety. All right, third topic, sense versus presence. A couple of years ago, someone asked me a great question. How do you prioritize when users are worried about like imaginary things versus the real threats that face them? Security people love to ask versions of this question. And my answer was, they're both real, and they both matter. And I found this diagram sort of helps people understand it. Think about people's level of their sense of threat versus the presence of threat. These are two independent dimensions. Neither is more important or less. If you neither sense a threat nor there is a threat, everything is great, relax, have a beer, wonderful day. Here's a space that everyone is pretty used to. People are aware of a real threat surrounding them. There's a clear and present danger, and your response is you need to mitigate the danger, communicate to people. We all know what to do. In this corner, people don't sense a threat, but there is a presence of threat. That's the invisible danger situation. People are unaware of the situation. What do? You mitigate the threat, and you communicate with care, because you don't want to trigger panic, you don't want to set off FUD. This corner also exists. People feel a sense of a threat going on, even though it's not an actual danger, but they're pretty sure that they are in some kind of risk. Privacy risk is, of course, a place where this happens rather a lot. Now, this bottom row is the domain of traditional risk analysis. Right? You say, if this goes wrong, what's going to happen? What do I do about it? How do I mitigate? We all know how to handle the bottom row. This column is a very important column to be aware of, too, because user perception affects action. Basically, if people are feeling this sense of unsafety, they will respond as though they are unsafe, and all of the negative things I was just talking about in the context of the Gottman ratio, this user attrition, this reduced usage, this care and panic, all of those things happen whenever you're in the right-hand column, and it doesn't matter if you're in the top or bottom. And importantly, when people don't know what's going on, they will quite rightly assume the worst. You can have the most legit privacy practices in the world, the most honorable stand-up things that you would defend in any situation, and if people don't actually know that, if they don't have a way to know what's going on, they have every reason to believe that your company is a malicious actor. Because historically, companies and governments and so on have tended to be malicious actors. Fear spreads in a vacuum. The remedy for being in the right-hand column, if your practices are actually legit, so especially if you're in the top right, is to communicate better. And one of the challenges you'll meet with this is your PR team. Or your legal team or some team like that. But there's a whole school of public relations that believes that the best thing to do is to say nothing. Anything you say is likely to create risk, and so therefore the correct solution is to always shut up. It is very important to find such teams and deal with them in various ways. Because the important thing to remember is this: if people are already afraid, you are already paying a price. You are already paying the PR price. People are assuming the worst, not the best. It doesn't matter how high your brand equity is. I know your marketing department will say that trust in your company is so high that this will make it okay. That is a lie. But here's the good news. Look for unexpected allies. One thing I found is that if you look at sort of the pool of comms teams, legal teams, marketing, public policy, and so on, most of them actually tend to do want to communicate and do want to communicate well. This kind of really scared behavior is actually an exception more than the rule. It's just a loud exception. And a really common situation is that everyone wants to communicate but is sure the other teams will say no. And I have found that the simple operation of getting everybody in a room and talking can make a lot of this go away. It's a super common thing. Marketing says, oh, we'd love to say this about privacy, but the legal team would never permit it. And I literally just turn to the lawyer and say, hey, lawyer, would it be okay if we said this? And he says, oh, yeah, just make sure not to use the following words. And the marketing says, oh, we didn't even want to use those words. Great, everyone, start writing. So in general, this is a tool for talking about perception in the language of risk, which is a language that business leaders tend to understand. If you're in the red, anywhere in the red, you have a problem. You are paying prices. Your company is paying a price anytime you're in this space, and you need to deal with it. All right, last item. This is a relatively short one. You're worried about a risk and the product VP isn't. Are they right? Are you right? What's going on? Is someone malicious? Here's a simple rule of thumb to remember. Activists, and as privacy specialists, you often will fit into this field, activists are focused on a problem, and they view every system in the world through the lens of their problem. System operators, which include product teams and that, they tend to be focused on a system, and they will view every problem in the world through the lens of a single system. This is your duality. Activists view systems through the lens of a problem. Operators view problems through the lens of a system. Imagine that this is your matrix of problems and systems. The system that most affects the problem isn't the problem that affects the system. Your activist focused on problem 3 says, oh wow, system 2 is a serious problem, we need to deal with this. Your operator focused on system 2, I don't know if you can even tell the color differences on this projector, says, oh wait, no, problem 1 is a way bigger issue than problem 3. When this happens, this misalignment of priorities is genuine. This is not a communication failure. This is 100% legit. There is genuinely a situation where people's priorities don't align, and you just have to recognize that and work with it. If you try to convince the other person that their priorities are wrong in situations like this, you will often fail because, no, their priorities are quite right for the situation they're in. In a situation like this, you're actually coming to this operator of the system, a product VP or someone like that, and you actually want something from them. Okay, so what do? You need to build social capital. You're going to be making a trade with them. You're going to be asking them to do you a favor, essentially. One important trick, do they have a persistent annoyance you can fix? Everyone has one thing that drives them nuts and they can never quite justify the resources to fix it. And if you make that problem go away for them, they will love you so much and they will do you a lot of favors in return. Can the thing you're trying to do move metrics that they care about? What are the numbers that they're being held to? What are the things they're stressed about? Generally, every VP has an axe hanging over their head. I don't know if you know this, but senior execs chew up VPs and throw them out nonstop, and they're very well aware that they could easily become the next victim. If you can't fix it yourself, is there someone else you can get to do that for you? Great advantage of being a privacy person is you talk to everybody, and so working out a three-way deal is often totally in your scope. Oh yeah, I can totally get the ads team to do this if you do that, and then just make sure that the person understands you're the one who's been pushing that. Look for their unspecified fears and pressures and help fix them. Caveat, this applies to non-adversarial relationships where you're not the person who's being drained. Helping Nazis will not make them stop being Nazis. Women are not the ones responsible for fixing sexism in the workplace. Please apply your common sense to this set of rules. But if you're a privacy professional, you often are in the situation where you're not the person who's directly the person being targeted by whatever is going wrong, and the goals are aligned because you're at the same company. Use that. That's a really big advantage in reporting. So to sum up, triage is about estimating risks and convincing people. The most useful tools for this give you a common language with which to do all of that. And to quote A.V. Flox, remember the human. People want to feel safe and to be safe. And this includes both your end users and the other stakeholders, the VPs and people like that in the room. when you can help them achieve that, when you can help them achieve that sense of safety, good things will follow. So thank you very much.